Good afternoon everyone, and a very warm welcome to Kellogg College and to this Meeting Minds session on character assassination. We're going to be looking at where does character fit in the murder mystery. I'm Clare Morgan. I'm Director of Master Studies in Creative Writing and a Fellow here at Kellogg College and a novelist and short story writer. Here is Anna Beer, my colleague, who is a prolific non-fiction writer, now a novelist, a murder mystery novelist, a visiting fellow here, and a creative writing teacher. And indeed, it was a great pleasure, has been a great pleasure, to have Anna contributing over a number of years to the Master of Studies in Creative Writing. And on my right is Chris Barkley, who is an alumnus of the Master of Studies in Creative Writing, and a novelist, and right here his own murder mystery novel. The main works we'll be referring to in this session are Anna's murder mystery Death of an Englishman, to be held up and waved at this point, and Chris's The Man on the Endless Stair, to be equally held up and waved. Strongly recommend both of those. And I can't hold up my murder mystery because I have faltered at the first or second fence in my attempts to do that. Because other things lead me away from the central strand of the murder mystery. So I think we'll be returning to that in our discussion of how these books work. So I will in fact be having as a central text the first murder mystery ever written, the Murders on the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. So we will have 45 minutes of this discussion, which I'm chairing, and it explores the writing, the ins and outs, ups and downs indeed, of murder mysteries, and then 15 minutes Q&A session when we would very much welcome questions from the floor. There will be a roving mic going round at that time. So let us proceed, and let me suggest a first question for us to consider. Anna, did you start with character or plot or something else in beginning your book?
As always, Claire asks a very tough question to start me off. As was mentioned, my background was writing non-fiction. I'm a half-escaped academic, and so I spent many years training myself to write like an academic, and then I spent many more years training myself to take my scholarship out to a wider readership in biographies and cultural studies written for non-specialists. And then I suddenly decided, for reasons we may get into later, that now was the time to finally turn to fiction. And to be honest, I began with plot, and that's because I'm fascinated by genre. That's something that runs through my academic work and my scholarly writing. I'm fascinated by plot, and I'm fascinated by history. And so I thought, unwittingly, that I would enjoy just playing, almost putting together a crossword puzzle. Detective fiction was often called puzzle fiction in its earliest days, but I'd have a really fun time doing it. Now, as Claire has already hinted, sometimes you start writing and things go wrong, and in my case, they went wrong rather gloriously. So what began as utterly plot-driven, formulaic even, very self-consciously, playfully formulaic, I was determined to enjoy having fun with genre, turned into what my agent shocked me by calling a novel. And that suggested to me that I'd actually created characters along the way, and a little bit of depth and a little bit of complexity. So for me, I began thinking about plot, enjoying the pleasures of, as it were, the acrostic, And it morphed into something, I still hope it's got a lot of pleasure of the whodunit and why they did it, but there's a lot more about character than I ever thought would happen. But that's what happens when you're writing.
Thanks, Anna. I completely understood. Chris, what about you?
So yes, thank you, what a wonderful question. To me, I think plot and character are essentially the same thing, or at least they share an essential nature. And when I go about planning a novel, I always start with character. What does the character want? And what's their super objective? And what are the things which are holding them back from achieving that super objective, and whether those hurdles are internal or external or both. So that's the thing that I start with when I'm writing, and then the plot just tends to happen. So, the main character in my novel is a young man named Ewan, and Ewan is a novelist. Where did I get that inspiration from? Ewan feels kind of locked into this cycle of trauma-induced inevitability. He's kind of clinging to this goal of, I will become a great writer. And so that's his super objective. And over the course of the novel, the world presents him with challenges to this worldview. He's summoned one day to an island in the Hebrides by his mentor, who's a renowned mystery novelist. And then the very next day, upon arrival, this mentor is discovered murdered. And it falls upon Ewan to track down the murderer and his mentor's final hidden manuscript. So when you have kind of that, the story just tends to fall into place. I don't know if you find the same.
I'm itching to jump in because Chris's book is absolutely marvellous. It's intelligent and compelling. But you mentioned the protagonist is a young man who's a novelist. And I have to admit that my protagonist, my detective, is a not so young woman with a background in academia and a love for the 16th and 17th century. And the thing I was going to say about that, and you helped me realise it, Chris, thank you, is that Eve Brooke, my detective, and she's a reluctant detective, like all good detectives are, is her quest for truth. And that's the historian's quest, it's the novelist's quest. It should be all of our quests, really, particularly in this crazy world that we live in at the moment, where we bandy around terms like post-truth and fake news. And so for me, I think that was a driving force in writing the book. And so both thematically and structurally, Eve finds out the truth about the death of an Englishman, but it's also an exploration of can we find truth and how difficult it is to find truth.
I think those are really interesting and related answers. I think what we can glean from that is that both these novels have, dare I say it, an autobiographical impulse behind them, perhaps to discover truth about oneself as a writer, as well as having one's characters discover truth or truths about things that happen in the text. But in the Murders on the Rue Morgue, it's very interesting because Edgar Allan Poe doesn't start with a plot at all. He starts by introducing two characters, the narrator and the super intelligent, observant Dupin. He spends the whole of the first section actually setting up Dupin's character, and we don't know until the second section that there are murders and these things have happened, but he sort of sets up the character first. And indeed, that leads me to the second point, which is the opening of Chris's and Anna's books are very different. They both start in a situation, a journey. In fact, Chris on the sea, and Anna at Oxford Railway Station. And we're each going to read just a very short piece of the text we're looking at. So I'll start with the Murders on the Rue Morgue, which was written in 1841, by the way. Paris. In Paris it was in the summer of 1840. There I first met that strange and interesting young fellow, Auguste Dupin. Dupin was the last member of a well-known family, a family which had once been rich and famous. He himself, however, was far from rich. He cared little about money. He had enough to buy the most necessary things of life and a few books. He did not trouble himself about the rest, just books. With books he was happy. When we first met, we were both trying to find the same book. As it was a book which few had ever heard of, this chance brought us together in an old bookstore. Later we met again in the same store, then again in another bookstore. Soon we began to talk. So that is the opening of this murder mystery, which is kind of quite far removed from murder or indeed mystery. But Chris, do you want to read the opening of yours?
Of course. Look carefully, please. The moment you turn away, everything changes. And when you look back, you'll have forgotten that for which you were searching. First, let your eye be drawn to me, young, straight-backed and certain. I was peering over the edge of a ferry, sea of the Hebrides churning below. It had become my habit to stand on the deck and watch for whales during the slow journey to the island. The trick I had found was to soften the vision, to allow the hem of the sky to fray into the sea, to take in everything at once. Then, when a fin bursts through, the landscape gathers about it, and the eye cannot help but be drawn. The little ferry seldom made this journey due to lack of demand. On most of my previous trips, I had been the only passenger. But on this occasion, my 5th visit since I returned from the war, there was another man with me. From inside, he flung open the cabin door and bolted across the deck, slipping on the spume-slick metal, crashing into the barrier. The column of vomit which left his mouth was thick and yellow, with the sour stench of a rich diet. It travelled in a heavy arc out over the edge of the ferry and into the water below. Afterwards, the man remained clutching the barrier, chest heaving. He was hairless and resembled a gourd stuffed into an expensive suit, with folds turned down at the outer corners of his eyes, making him seem perpetually sombre.
Yes, the question of balancing character and plot situation there, I think, are very wonderfully revealed to us, because we've got absolute character. We've got that inextricable from the situation and the potential for mysterious happenings coming up. Anna, can we have your opening and your thought of balance?
Yes, I'm going to cheat slightly by just giving an explanation. There are actually 3 openings to my book. There's an epigraph, which I'll read, which many of you will recognise from the 16th century. There's then a teaser, which is absolutely the plot, genre, the flag saying this is about genre. And then I'll actually read you the opening paragraph of the book, which takes us to the realm that Clare was invoking of character. So bear with me. Epigraph. I am not I. Pity the tale of me. Sir Philip Sidney is Astrophil and Stella. Here's the teaser. There is an uncanny stillness to an Oxford quad as midnight approaches. The modern world is held at bay. If you were to stand in the cloisters and listen, you would more likely hear the imagined footsteps of monks than the actual laughter of students. The thick medieval walls keep their counsel. Tonight, they hide the sound of a man's last rasping breaths, while the darkness and a dozing porter allow a woman to slip out of the college, back into the present, But there is a witness to both the fugitive and the dying. A witness who hears the Oxford bells begin their midnight toll and chooses to do nothing. For now. Chapter 1. Spring was making a very uncertain advance upon winter. Eve studied the trees for signs of life, impatient for buds, glad of every daffodil, but also with the knowledge that April, a couple of weeks away, would still likely be the cruelest month. She was better at stoic tolerance of cold, grey March skies than she was at the abundance of spring. Oxford Station was grey, a bitter wind making the waiting passengers hunch into their winter coats, and the coffee she held had been a waste of money. And yet, Eve still felt the surge of anticipation that any train journey generated. There was even an exquisite pleasure in choosing her route to London. Would it be the straightforward, quick and dirty speed of the GWR, or the pleasure of arriving after a meander through the Chilterns at elegant Marylebone Station? And even if the journey itself was prosaic, she could indulge in fantasies as the train passed suburban villas, shopping centres and industrial estates. Where next? She would think, in the full knowledge that her final destination today was a publisher's office in Soho. But there had been enough times when she had set off from Oxford and her London terminal had been merely a stepping stone to Mallaig, Cardiff, Narvik, Marrakesh. Eve settled back into her seat. Once this jump was out of the way, she'd head somewhere exciting. All was well. The train was on time. And the coffee wasn't that bad, really.
Well, I think we have examples there of how the notion of creation of character is built in alongside the starting off of the reader's engagement with what might happen, what is there waiting up ahead, and all those associated things. I think an interesting thing about Edgar Allan Poe is that he, in the several sections of this short, it isn't a novel, it's a short story, of the murders in the Rue Morgue, he tells the same story again and again, but then sort of expands upon it. So he starts 1840, the murders, each time, but then he gives a slightly different slant on how the tale is narrated and what are the details, at the same time sort of building so we know more and then more and then more and then more. And so I think Poe was doing that sense of creating the possibilities of mystery for us, while at the same time, as I demonstrated by just reading the very opening, setting up character. And there are two characters there, the narrator, who is somewhat in thrall to Dupin. That's Dupin to live with him. He's in thrall of Dupin's perspicaciousness, his acuity, his perceptiveness, and his amazing powers of deduction. And I think that that way of being very much feeds into many, many subsequent murder mysteries over decades and over centuries. Now, Poe wasn't modelling this on any previous murder mystery because it was the first one, but people like Wilkie Collins coming afterwards clearly were influenced by this mode of telling, in particular the sort of complexities of layered storytelling. And people like, you know, our very well-known Hercule Poirot, always the detective who is really a detective, so to speak, but outwits the plodding hand of the law. That's very much in Edgar Allan Poe's piece. But I wonder, Chris, in terms of modelling, did you model or have in mind a kind of pattern from a previous things that you'd read when you were writing The Man on the Endless Stair?
So, yes, so, The Man on the Endless Stair is set on an island. This is a trope in mystery fiction. In a way, you leave society, you move away to the edge in order to examine what do we deem acceptable as a society, what is right and what is wrong. I think an island is a wonderful place to examine those questions. It's sort of the physical manifestation of that question. And so, of course, Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None was a great inspiration for me when I was writing this. But I'm also really fascinated by metafiction. Italo Calvino and Jorge Luis Borges are idols of mine. And this book discusses idolatry and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But yeah, so I was kind of considering these questions, and one thing I wanted to pull out was that in these classic pieces of detective fiction, I feel a lot of the time it's very much an external journey. There is the murder, and we have to work out how it happened. And the detective is piecing together clues in a kind of recursive way, but playing things over and over in our minds. How did this get there? What was the weapon? All this sort of stuff. And so when I was writing The Man on the Endless Stair, I wanted that external journey to be a reflection of the internal journey. And Anna, it's so fascinating that you also have chosen a writer as your protagonist, because I think as writers that's what we're doing when we're composing a novel. We're going on this inward journey, asking ourselves questions. Well, what am I writing about? And perhaps the difference between a literary mystery and a traditional murder mystery is that maybe a literary mystery doesn't give an answer. I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's, no, I just say a couple of things in between, because I think this is really a point worth dwelling on. But I'd really like to know about your pattern, or what you were basing your work on, Anna, and then indeed would love to morph into whether there are literary fiction murder mysteries and others, and if so, what do we mean by that? But your pattern first would be great to hear.
Yes, I will talk about it in one moment, but I just want to pick up on something that Chris said. Not only is the protagonist a writer, but the person who dies is a writer. There are no spoilers in that. And funnily enough, I also kill off a writer. So I think that if we want to get very, very meta about all this, there are a lot of writers, a lot of books, and interestingly, Dupin is met in bookshops. So plenty of space for thinking about books. So in terms of my influences, my models, I was one of those children who took out 5 Agatha Christie novels from the local public library every week and read every single one and just kept going. And Christie stands at the pinnacle of writing the puzzle mystery. There is no, or minimal interiority, there's minimal psychological depth, but by goodness, she is a genius at delivering on plot, and the exceptional individual who can see past the mistakes that we ordinary mortals are doing. And Sherlock Holmes is the same. I once had the misfortune of putting Conan Doyle's stories onto a serious literary class, and realised it was very, very difficult to take it seriously, given the fact that the prose is so wooden. But as a trope, as a formula, oh my goodness, it is obviously one of the along with Mickey Mouse, apparently Sherlock Holmes is the most recognisable figure in all of literature. That's a fact. Now, back to the point, which is, so as I mentioned earlier, perhaps I set out trying to write a homage to the Golden Age mysteries that I love, the Agatha Christie's, the Marjorie Allenhams, the Ngaio Marshes, other writers like Freeman Wills-Croft. I happen to be passionate about railways. He's been dismissed as a humdrum writer. He's humdrum, but he's very, very good at being humdrum, and I recommend him warmly to all of you, and a lot of his plots rely on a detail of train timetabling. Again, no interiority at all. But In the end, the person I come back to is Dorothy L. Sayers, and if I may, just in case there's anybody who is interested in hearing more about Sayers and crime fiction, and indeed about my own work, I'll be speaking at Somerville College in December. Do look up on their website. So I won't speak much about her now, and I hope that some of you may come back and hear more about that then. But Sayers got a lot of grief because people felt she had written, particularly in Gaudy Night, and that's very appropriate to us all meeting today, had written or tried to written a novel that was character-driven, that didn't even have a murder in it, and that somehow she'd spoiled the genre by being pretentious and serious and what have you. Those of you who know Gaudy Night, you'll probably be divided. Some of you will love it, some of you will think, yes, she should have had a good editor and stuck to writing crime fiction. And in fact, she turned around, and showed that she could write that if she wanted to. What I'm trying to get at is I don't think there's any, I don't think we need to separate the intellectual from the enjoyable. And that's the point that Sayers is making in Gaudy Night, and Harriet Vane turns up at her college, loosely based on Somerville, as Sayers herself had been. And she goes tooth and nail at the intellectual discussions, theological discussions, moral discussions. It's all very, very intellectual. And at the same time, the warden is hoovering up Harriet's crime fiction. And so Sayers is making the case, we can have both. We can have rigour and intellect and thoughtfulness. We can also play and have fun with fiction as fiction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The sort of not very soundly based distinction between a literary novel and an other novel. I think we're rather past that. I hope so anyway. However, for myself, I do find that there are some murder mysteries that I just actually can't be bothered to read, not only murder mysteries, but others. And that is because at the level of language, they don't work for me. At the level of language, they are mundane, and so they don't kind of excite my imagination. They don't open up doors into worlds at the level of language, and so I get rather tired of just the sort of what happens next when there's no vivacity of expression or curiosity within the way the language is formed. And certainly with Poe, I didn't find that at all. He writes obviously very much of an era, but the sort of elegance of how he writes and the way the language actually drives, is a motor for characterization, and the way the language reveals things far beyond what is said, kind of keep one engaged on a very different level. I wonder, Chris, whether you have any thoughts on that, and the sort of role of a literary, let's say, that kind of use of language in your own work, and what do you think about that generally?
Again, fantastic question. So yes, I'm fascinated by language. I encountered actually during the masters Italo Calvino's wonderful handbook on writing, the 6 Memos for the Next Millennium. One of these essays is on exactitude, which he defines, let's see if I can remember, exactness of planning, and exactness in the choice of the actual word, and an exactness of theme and idea. And he says even when aspiring towards vagueness and mystery, we've both written mysteries, we should be using the lighthouse should be exactitude. We should be being exact in how we're conjuring that spirit of vagueness. And you know, the main character is a novelist. It's told from a first-person perspective, and it's all about his cognitive process as he's kind of relinquishing his tendency to strive, to control, to be the best novelist he can be. He's going on a journey of letting that go. So the novel's about that cognitive process. So choosing the first person perspective, using that language, I think was very important to me when I was writing the novel, because I really wanted to show that interior journey, and I think the language is vital to that.
Thanks, Chris. In Poe's work, it is a first-person narrator, but in narrating what his colleague Dupin is doing, relating what happens in the murders. So it is in the first person, but it is very much sort of relating stories within stories. Anna, your narrative is third person. Could you say something about why you chose the third person and how that affected what you wrote?
Absolutely, but just before that, can I pick up on something that Chris was saying, because it's just so interesting, about the pleasure we get, both from creating these books, but also hoping to give pleasure to other people reading them. Claire, you know, it's a pleasure you haven't found in some of the more formulaic crime fiction that you've read. I want to sing in praise of formula. I quite like a well-written cliche, something that does what it says on the tin. There are times, I mean, okay, I hoovered up Agatha Christie when I was 10. In the interval between my mother's passing and her funeral, I went hiking in the hills of Wales to clear my head. I took with me another 5 Agatha Christie books. I didn't want depth and psychological nuance. I didn't want political comment. I didn't even want beautiful language. The other good thing to do with Agatha Christie is to read it in a language you don't know very well. I can just about manage Christie in French. Now, that is not to demean her. I'm just saying that there are other pleasures to be had from books that are simply very well crafted. Third person, to answer the question. Yes, my book is written in the third person, but the most important mind that I enter is Eve, the protagonist, and so I'm playing fast and loose with third person. It's certainly not an omniscient third person, because that would spoil the mystery, wouldn't it? And the whole point is, as with Chris's book, who plays this in a hugely subtle and I think very brave way, brave is good, by the way, is that the reader in all good crime fiction is engaged in the same journey as the protagonist, as the detective. We have to be literally on the same page, discovering as we go on. And that's one of the things that I struggle with some biographies, and in writing biographies myself, is to remember that when people live their lives, they didn't know the outcome. And to keep that sense of the now. And Chris, having read your book, I think you do that superbly. You keep us, not just through the use of first person, but we are in the mind of your protagonist and sharing all that uncertainty. The third person, I can't do that quite as in such a sophisticated way, but then again, I'm not trying to. Can I say one more thing though about coming back to Calvino and the lighthouse and precision? One of the reasons I love crime fiction, and you can dismiss it, is being called the literature of convalescence, or it only offers comfort and escapism. But I actually think, I agree with Raymond Chandler, the detective story is a tragedy with a happy ending, or it's a romance in the profound, deeper, older sense, as you can tell, I belong in the 16th century. Yes, we get our happy ending, we get our closure, we get our but we know it's fictional. And there's an limitation to that. We put the book down and we have to return somehow to the real world. What interests me about Chris's book is that you're playing fast and loose with the idea of reality itself. I don't go quite that far. I'd love you to talk more about how you how you kept yourself honest, as it were, how you stayed in the mind of your protagonist using that first person.
Yeah, great. So complex, but I should say for the past 2 years I have worked for the Edinburgh International Book Festival, working in an alternative school with young trauma experienced people, and I work teaching them creative writing. Teaching is a strange word, drawing out creative writing from the young folks. But I was witnessing like these young people living in these cycles of trauma. And so these were the questions which were going through my head at the time. How do you escape a cycle of trauma in which everything feels rigid and definite and already decided, almost like you're a pawn in a game? And that's how Ewan feels. He's a war veteran, and he's lost his sister. He feels like it's just cause and effect and he has no say in the matter, and that's his trauma response. And so over the process of the novel, the universe kind of presents him with challenges to that, and I don't want to spoil too much, but these are questions which I'm considering in my own life. And what's fascinating to me is that these questions are being discussed in the world of science right now, particularly quantum mechanics. Do we live in a deterministic universe of cause and effect, where everything can be described through differential equations, or do we live in a world of uncertainty, which is terrifying but also beautiful, because it's that uncertainty which allows us to make choices, and to have the free will to participate. And the interpretation of quantum theory which I'm speaking about here is cubism, Q-B-I-S-M. So I was doing lots of research into that, and I think there is a tendency to view science and psychology as separate, but they're very much the same. And that was what I was thinking about when I was writing this. And I think the detective novel is a wonderful skeleton on which to hang these questions.
That's a really interesting question and answer. Clearly your research and your consideration of important theoretical issues is one of the things that kind of kept you on track for this book. That's what I'm understanding. Would that be fair? And I think something just out of the last few points, I think there's a big difference between formula, which I love if it's Raymond Chandler, if it's Agatha Christie, wonderful. There's a big difference between that and the kind of formulaic mystery or other book that is churned out with a lot of just banal language. I differ from Anna, and I don't warm to the whatever it is. Which cliche was it? The well-used cliche. No, I don't warm to that at all, because I want to see the world freshly and pointedly through the language that that I'm reading. I did that with Edgar Allan Poe, so it's got nothing to do with this era as opposed to another. I see that actually with Agatha Christie. I do see it also with Raymond Chandler, a big favourite of me, and indeed of my parents. So I had access to Chandler when I was very small. So I think those things are important too. But I wonder, I'm just looking at the time, and I wonder whether we could consider how our own engagement in teaching, or I would first say facilitating the development of creative writers, how that may have had an impact on our own work. So Anna, would you like to have a go with that?
Absolute pleasure, because it takes me back to my teaching on the Creative Writing Masters programme. I was brought in a number of years ago now, at the very beginning, I believe, of a strand of non-fiction. And I remember students arriving, they arrived as poets and playwrights and novelists, what have you. And I think some of them are a little bit ambivalent about spending a long afternoon talking about non-fiction, boring. And the thing that I learned most powerfully was a question that I asked them in the first class. I said, imagine you're sitting where I am in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, whatever. What would you say is the most important thing you want to do as a writer? What's the most important act that you're going to do as a writer? And they wrote all these down, and we looked at them all, and I said, are these only true for fiction or poetry, what have you? And in the end, you realise it's all words. It's all words, it's all writing. Nevertheless, it took me 10 years to finally have the courage to write my own fiction, because it felt like speaking a completely different language to me, and I looked at the courage and determination of those creative writing students, their willingness to take risks, their perseverance in the face of many, many knockbacks, personal and professional. And I've just been overwhelmed and delighted to see so many of them flourish, and flourish perhaps in genres and in ways that they didn't first expect. So I told myself very sternly that if they could do it, so could I. That's the biggest gift that teaching gave me.
I think that's a really telling thing to say, and I endorse it wholeheartedly. I think that working with helping writers develop is a huge way of helping oneself to develop too. We learn as much as we impart in that process. And Chris, I would love to hear what you feel about any ways in which your own experience in the field of creative writing has fed into the emergence of this lovely book.
Well, I was actually taught on the Oxford Creative Writing Masters by Clare and Anna, so better be careful here. But in all honesty, there was this culture of drawing out rather than instilling on the Creative Writing Masters, which was demonstrated by both of you. So I think it's a perilous thing to teach creative writing, because to write creatively is to express the self, and that's a tender thing. So to have a teacher who kind of guides and shepherds rather than tells, I think is so important, and that's definitely something I've witnessed here, and that's something which I took forward working with these trauma-experienced young people in North Edinburgh, and seeing that maybe I have more experience in the industry, but everyone has stories to tell, and there is no value on that. Every story is just as valid as every other one, because it's personal lived experience, and who am I to judge yours, because I cannot be you. So I also think when you're teaching, funnily I teach a martial art called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's a really strange thing to translate something which is kind of unconscious, which your body does instinctually, into words, moving the unconscious into the conscious. That's such a peculiar act, and I don't think anyone really quite understands how we do it, but we do it. And I think that's what we're doing when we're writing as well. We're bringing the unconscious into the conscious.
That's such a gift of a lead-in, because as I said, I set out to write a really quite frivolous, light-hearted detective novel, and I was surprised as anyone that what started out as play took me as an author to, I've got a list here: death, illness, desertion, Alzheimer's, religion, faith, creativity, politics, sexuality, Andrew Tate, so help us God, sex work, and to my own ambivalence about Oxford University and the publishing industry. I could go on. That journey, I don't think I would have taken on. I should also say that it isn't just about, there's another kind of teaching that I've done. I was very fortunate, and Clare's been a recipient of this as well, to have been given a Royal Literary Fund Writing Fellowship, which gave me 2 years of regular income, and what you do is you work with students. I did a year at Plymouth and a year here at Kellogg, and you work with students on anything that's troubling them about their writing. It could be a CV or an essay, what have you, not creative writing. And that gave me two things. One is that encountering every single day people bringing me their writing and thinking, how can I help them make this work better? How can I help them express what they want to express, whatever that may be? It also gave that little bit of security, a little cushion of security that we all need as writers. And that, again, is the beauty of studying, is that you've got this space of 2 years, whatever the pressures, the structure and space to grow as a writer. And so I feel very grateful for that chance, both on teaching on that and being now, as I feel almost in my own mind, on the other side of it.
Yeah, I think I identified with all those points that Chris and Anna have raised. I think it's also worth saying that as someone who facilitates the development of creative writers, one has to be a very big reader. You aren't a writer unless you're an absolutely dug-in reader. And one thing that does, apart from expanding one's acquaintance across all the genres, within the genres, it develops one's skills as a critic. I don't mean critic with a big C, I mean critic with a small c. Because if we're writing, we need to be able to step out of that sort of quasi-magical writerly state that Chris was alluding to, where something unconscious you find it's manifested itself before you into the word on the page. You need to be able to step back from that and be able to look at your work as an editor, as a reader. I think that's one of the most difficult things for writers to get to grips with, is the ability to create freely, but also at the appropriate moment to be able to step back and look very coolly at what it is you've done, what you think of it, with a number of different hats on, depending on, who do you think you're writing for, what kind of audience. But you need to be able to see that with a degree of clarity, which does take quite a long time to develop. And I would suspect that Chris and Anna would concur that in the books that they have produced, and certainly in my own fiction, and indeed in a fine way in reading Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, we're all bringing our critical selves to bear, which have been enhanced certainly by our experience, not only in our own reading and writing, but in working with our students in whatever arena to help them develop this skill as well. Now, I'm very much aware that we are about 3/4 of the way through this hour, so if people with the roving mics are ready, then we'd very much like to take questions from the floor, and I will let Juliana sort of go up to anyone and then find the next person. Thanks.
Hi. There's a lot of talk about the journey in this conversation, and I was wondering, especially in regards to Agatha Christie, my mum, who loved reading her, and I love reading her too, used to say, but she never let us work out the problem. She never let the reader discover what was going on. So in terms of the journey of the reader, how do you address that? What journey do you want your reader to go on from this, or is it something you think about?
It's something I think about a lot, and if you'll permit me to return to my special interest, which is cubism and quantum theory. It's this idea that we participate with reality. When we experience the world, we make a choice, we make probability assignments, and then we kind of collaborate with this quantum wave function, with this kind of mesh of probabilities, and if that mesh if that feedback is positive, then that thing happens, and this is the way the thinking is going. So that's what we're doing when we're writing and reading. It's a collaborative act, and so I think it's so interesting to explore that question and allow the reader to participate. That was, I think Agatha Christie she's one of my heroes. I admire her work so deeply, but a lot of her stories are puzzle boxes, and it can be wonderful to admire the intricacy of a puzzle box. But sometimes I feel frustrated that I can't help in the generation of that puzzle box. So hopefully, that's what I've aspired to do in this story. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Only to say that having not yet succeeded in my own murder mystery, I got distracted on the journey, I suppose, so far, because the journeys of my fiction, the journey I'd like to take readers on in terms of my fiction, is one of a fuller understanding of some aspect of being in the world. That sounds very grand. It isn't. It's like, okay, I get it. I want the reader to think, okay, I get it about a certain human situation, which includes the sort of emotional and psychological aspects of being a person who has lived through certain things. So that's the kind of journey. I suppose it's partly one might call it an existential journey, but again, that sounds much too high-flown. It's about being in the world and how we understand what we are and what other people are. And I would like to think that readers of my work have thought about that, at least, and thought, okay, that's it. And Chris, you said something very kind about a novella that's in my latest collection of short stories, which is called Scar Tissue. Chris read it and wrote to me about it, and said that he had been on that kind of journey to get more to grips with an understanding of a sort of taxing issue that some human beings face, and that he felt that in entering that world with strong, powerful emotions in it, that had enlarged your sense of things. And that's true, wasn't it?
Definitely. Sorry, you go.
Okay, no, that's it really. I was going
You're right.
Thanks, Chris. I was going to hand to Anna for this question too.
I'll try to give a very quick answer. I think I would have failed in my first objective, which was to write I don't like the term, cosy crime, gentle crime novel, if people had guessed who did it too soon. So that journey is really important to me as an author. I'm playing very fair with the reader. I give you the clues. There's enough there for you to try and guess who it is, and I've heard from people who 9 out of 10, I would say, are surprised by who gets it. That said, you're really referring to a kind of more profound journey, and it is no coincidence that Eve begins her investigation sitting on Oxford Station, and that journey could literally, today it's taking her to London, it could take her to Narvik or Marrakesh. She has a dream of going on a journey on a glorious train through Turkey, and which she never achieves. That is the only spoiler you're getting. She doesn't get on that train, and that's significant to her because she's in a grand tradition of detectives who are really quite unhappy, but briefly, while they're solving the crimes, they get a sense of purpose. And I think that's, if we're talking about tropes in literature, in crime literature, I think that's a very powerful one. Again, well, no, we're not here to talk about Christie.
Okay, another question?
Hi, thanks. Anna, you weren't happy with the woodenness of Conan Doyle's prose, I would point out that it depends whether it's coming through his narrator, the wooden Dr. Watson, or whether, as in the second half of Studying Scarlet and Valley of Fear, it's his own voice. But that's not really my point. That might be my point. My point is, Conan Doyle wrote to be read in instalments. I'm sorry about this, but it's failing. He wrote to be read in instalments, whereas obviously yourselves write to be read as a job lot. Wilkie Collins wrote to be read in instalments. I think Edgar Wallace did. And how much difference does it make how you envisage how your book will be read and who will read it in the way that you construct your story?
Thank you, that's such an interesting question. I'm going to try not to give a long lecture about the genesis of the detective novel, but you're absolutely right. My great hero of the 19th century, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, author of Lady Audley's Secret, but also The Trail of the Serpent, which preceded Wilkie Collins's forays into the genre. She was absolutely, she was like Chandler writing, you know, a penny a word or cent for a word, I can't remember what Chandler was paying, pulp fiction. I'm obsessed with pulp fiction. I think pulp fiction is wonderful. And these writers who had to produce to deadlines, Braddon somehow had what turned into novels, 3-decade novels later, novels on the go, and a stage adaptation. She was prolific. Okay, I think you might lose some polish along the way, but you get the energy, you get the cliffhangers, and you get the risk-taking, I think, of an author who is flying by the seat of their pants, as it were, and is hugely responsive to readers. So Braddon went head-to-head with Dickens, and Lady Audley's Secret did better than Great Expectations. And they were, you know, it's cliffhanger after cliffhanger. So I have nothing against, and in fact I think a lot of the energy of early crime novels comes from that. As I say, I'm not going to turn this into a lecture on things. I think the novel itself changes enormously, as we all know, over the course of the 19th century. But the one thing I'll say is that Henry James, who we might say is the ultimate prose stylist, the ultimate serious novelist, he heaped praise, and a little bit of condemnation, but mainly praise on Mary Elizabeth Braddon, because he's one of those novelists who could understand that she did what she did very, very well.
Another question?
Thank you. I hope the mic's working okay. Excellent. Thanks so much for a really fascinating discussion. I was very interested in the concept of the quasi-magical world that you all step into and then at times step out of to coolly review. Now, I've heard tell, and I'd be interested in your views, on whether a creative writing master's helps you enter and stay in that world, or whether the inner critic that has been strengthened by your ability to analyse other authors starts jumping in too quickly, and how that experience has been for all of you. I'm also fascinated by the journey from non-fiction to fiction, and then almost in a way I'm sensing potentially through to what extent memoir might appeal or not appeal to any of you in terms of your own. Fascinates me listening to you.
Thanks for that question, which is sort of really in 3 parts. The first part about whether the Masters in Creative Writing or studying creative writing would tend to cause your inner critic to jump in too soon. No, I think just the opposite, actually. I think a degree in English Lit may cause your inner critic to jump in too soon. I can say that because I have one. So, and I'm jolly glad I do. And it's been a basis for all sorts of things, including my last novel. So I love studying English literature, but the creative writing masters, at least as we have it here, is very much about a fruitful and appropriate balance between writing and reading, and teasing out the absolute intersectionality of those two things, and then out of that emerges, as it were, with the help of the close discussions with tutors and with each other on the programme, the ability to inhabit one world and then inhabit another. But it is something one has to learn, I think, over time, and through bitter times when one hasn't been able to do it, and I think that continues throughout one's life. But sort of one gets more adept at it. You take the third a bit about potential for memoir. I've written fiction, novels, short stories. I've written non-fiction. I've written published a book called What Poetry Brings to Business. You can't have much more non-fictional than that, although I can say I used postmodernist tropes and did all sorts of things in it, which was rather fun. In terms of turning to memoir, that's really interesting because fiction, let me put it this way, the publishing industry is really quite interested in non-fiction or memoir at the moment, as opposed to some kinds of fiction, because it has been quite hard to sell. And I'm currently working on a memoir-based book about poetry and the value of poetry. I've missed out the central bit of your question. Are you going to answer the central bit of this question?
Which was? Well, was it about balance? Yeah, so wonderful. I love that question. It's something which I've been thinking about myself. I think I did an English literature undergraduate, and the terms which I like to use with this kind of creative versus critical mind when we're writing are supposing and recording. When we're supposing, we're kind of open to any possibility, but that can be overwhelming and chaotic at times. And there's the recording, which is much more critical and containing. And I think, depending on the individual, we will occupy different parts of that spectrum. But my experience on the masters here was that the tutors paid attention to that. And if I can finish with John Keats. John Keats spoke about negative capability, which is this idea of to hold two seemingly opposing truths in your mind without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. And I think when we are writing, we need to hold these two truths in our mind between supposing and recording. So my advice would be to look at where you are on that spectrum and maybe make your next choice based upon that.
Thanks very much, Chris. Do we have one more question?
Oh. So it's just a small thing. I was just wondering if there was any specific thought process when it came to naming your characters. I thought maybe you might have different processes, considering you, Chris, you were more character driven when you were coming up with the story. Maybe it was if there was any processes at all. Or is just random?
To answer that will be a spoiler. But I think Eve is your main character, and Anna has previously written a novel called, not a novel, non-fiction book called Eve Bites Back, and perhaps that's a nice thing.
Yes.
Yes, for all of those who are still recovering from your academic life, do you know what it was like to write fiction and not have to stick to the truth? I could call these people whatever I liked. I could do a kind of control search and change the names. But for some reason, my protagonist just had to be Eve, and I had just finished the book Eve Bites Back, which actually turns back to the question before, which I honestly could spend an entire hour unpicking all those questions there, but I'm going to try not to, is that I find that two things. I've written 14 books. Every time I start a new book, I've no idea how I'm going to do it. I don't believe I can. There's this terrible gap between self-belief and actually what the thing I've set myself. And I think, how did I do it? How did I do it? And somehow you just keep going. And in a way, that's the magic. It's a rather prosaic magic. But staying with, and Clare, you do a course right at the beginning, or a session right at the beginning of Creative Writing Masters, I don't know whether it still exists, called Writing Despite. And I think that has stayed with me always. We all write despite, but also with all the people and the experiences and the trauma and the joys and the abilities that we have. So that's the magic place, writing despite.
I think that's really well put, and writing despite and keeping going is what I think we all believe in and all do, and sometimes we have a respite from writing despite, which is, for example, spending this hour happily engaging with you, our audience, and taking your questions. I'm very much aware we've come to the end of the hour, so apologies to people who haven't had a chance to air the questions that they wanted to ask. But I believe we have coffee and tea at the back, and we will be around for a little while, so do feel free to raise any of those questions with us. And just to say thank you very much for being a wonderful audience, and we hope you enjoyed the session.